Malta's Prime Minister Joseph Muscat resigns over the murder of a journalist who exposed government links to corruption. Is this enough to stem public anger? And will those responsible for Daphne Caruana Galicia's death face justice? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Supporters of Malta's Prime Minister called him the king, praising him as a national hero. But Joseph Muscat's critics say he allowed corruption to run rife. Now he's been forced to resign over the murder of an investigative journalist 2 years ago. A car bomb killed Daphne Caruana Galizia not long after she exposed alleged corruption involving Muscat in his ministers. Businessman Yorgen Fenech, who has close links with the government, was charged last week with complicity in the murder. Protesters say Muscat is too close to the investigation. He's bowed to pressure and announced he will step down next month.
As Prime Minister, I promised 2 years ago that justice would be done in the case of the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. From the very beginning, we made sure that the police had all the resources available. Europol and other international services were also fully involved. I kept my word. Not only do we have 3 people accused of this murder, but now someone accused of being the principal person behind this killing. These arrests were possible only because of our willingness to see justice for this shocking murder.
Let's have a closer look on why her story has influenced politics in Malta. Daphne Caruana Galizia was a leading anti-corruption journalist who wrote for Malta's biggest publications and owned a popular blog called Running Commentary. She exposed alleged corruption among Malta's business elite and politicians at the highest level of government. This included Joseph Muscat's wife as part of a 2016 story on secret Panama-based companies. Muscat and his wife denied any wrongdoing. The Panama Papers revelations later showed 2 of Muscat's close associates, Conrad Midze and Keith Schembri, were also involved in secret offshore business. Both Schembri, Muscat's chief of staff, and Midze, the tourism minister, have resigned. They deny all allegations. Let's bring in our guest. Joining us on Skype from Bidnia in Malta, Andrew Caruana Galizia, Daphne Caruana Galicia's son. He and his family have been pushing for an independent investigation into his mother's death. In London, on Skype, Rebecca Vincent, UK Bureau Director of Reporters Without Borders. And also on Skype from Malta's capital, Valletta, Herman Grech, Editor-in-Chief of the Times of Malta newspaper. Thank you for you all. Andrew, the resignation of the decision by the Prime Minister to resign by the new year, how do you see it? Is it a significant step forward, or do you think the government must take more measures in the near future?
The Prime Minister hasn't actually resigned. He's simply announced an intention to resign at some point in the future. He hasn't even given a date. He's given a date for his party's leadership elections, but he hasn't given a date for when he'll step down once a new leader has been elected. So I could foresee a situation where the Prime Minister will remain Joseph Muscat. The leader of his party will be someone different. And if the leader of his party, the new leader, isn't someone who he can trust or who he doesn't believe is loyal to him, my fear is that Joseph Muscat will refuse to step down as Prime Minister. He has an enormous interest in remaining in power because, as the world has just discovered, his chief of staff, former chief of staff, is now implicated in my mother's assassination.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, is this announcement somehow an acknowledgement by the government that it had failed in the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia?
I would hope at this point that the government would acknowledge that, but actually their rhetoric suggests quite the opposite. So this is not actually the first iteration we've seen of the Prime Minister claiming that he will resign. And as Andrew has mentioned, let's wait and see what happens in January. But frankly, the lack of political responsibility in Malta for more than 2 years now is shocking.
Mm-hmm. Herman, we always thought that there would be a political implication to the assassination, to the brutal killing of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Do you think that this announcement by the government, by the PM to resign, is an ultimate political price to pay for the case?
It is a political price, but there's certainly no admission of any link to the crime at this stage. I think the Prime Minister was forced to leave for two reasons. There are unprecedented number of protests here in Malta. I have never seen these kinds of protests in Malta. Normally in Malta, when we don't like something, we just go on Facebook and complain. People are out in the streets complaining, saying this is not right. Secondly, when we got to know last week that the Chief of Staff was actually questioned in connection with the murder, then there came internal pressure. We know cabinet members from within his own party are saying this is not quite right. How can you have a Chief of Staff being questioned in connection with the murder? And he was your right-hand man, he's your buddy, and he was also involved, Keith Kemble was also involved in meetings with the security service discussing Daphne Caruana Galicia's murder.
Andrew, there is an investigation which is underway, but however, you've been saying many times in the past that the government's response has been an institutional failure.
Well, yes. I mean, my mother was murdered for a reason. She was investigating corruption. None of her investigations were actually followed up by the police. If they had done so, then my mother would still be alive. This is the one fact that makes me and my family so angry. My mother didn't need to die. If people had been doing their jobs in our institutions, then she would still be here with us today. And there's still, at least my perception is that the investigations into financial crime are extremely slow. So if my mother hadn't been assassinated 2 years ago, today there would likely still be impunity for the high-level corruption that took place within government and that is still likely taking place. This is the shocking thing, that it took an assassination for anything to happen. And even after that, it took 2 years for any real results to begin to show. And after those 2 years, we discovered that one of the people involved in the assassination, Keith Kemble, the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, was actually receiving detailed updates on the police investigation. And by detailed updates, I don't mean, look, we're making progress. I mean dates of arrests, people the police were planning to arrest, for example. And we know that some of the people arrested by the police in connection with my mother's murder knew that the police were coming for them. So that put the police in grave danger. Policemen could have been killed by these people. That's a huge amount of responsibility, and we need serious accountability for what happened.
Rebecca, you have protests on the streets and you have also this announcement by the Prime Minister. Is this something which is going to give more momentum to the need to find out more details about the circumstances surrounding the death of Daphne Caruana and, most importantly, about who gave the order to assassinate her?
Absolutely. There is clearly momentum continuing to build. We're seeing numbers protesting on the streets in Malta greater than we have over the past 2 years. And the focus really must remain on the need for full justice. So, of course, the arraignment of Yorgen Fenech is not enough, and some steps towards political resignations are not enough. We continue to call for every single person involved in every aspect of this attack to be identified and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And indeed, that includes all masterminds.
Herman, there is clearly a panic in the ruling Labour Party. Why is this panic? Is it because they are concerned that one day there might be this established link between the Prime Minister and the assassination of Daphne Caruana? Or is it just because now the whole accusations are focused on the fact that the PM himself has been trying to cushion his inner circle, the Chief of Staff, the Minister of Tourism, the Minister of Economy, from any personal link to the assassination of Daphne?
I think it's all of the above in reality. You've got a situation where what happened last week was quite shocking. The details which started emerging last week were shocking. when you get to know that the chief of staff apparently tried to forward a letter to Yorgen Fenech, who is now being charged with the murder. He tried to get him a letter through his doctor to possibly, from what we are understanding now, pinning the murder on another cabinet member. This has sparked panic within cabinet members of government. People were actually asking, people have said there and did nothing about the fact that 2 government officials owned Panama companies 3 years ago. Nowadays they're saying, hang on, this is now, there's a limit to all what's happening. You mean your person is actually involved with a potential murderer? And remember one other thing. Yorgen Fenech is now making certain statements in prison saying, give me a pardon myself and I will speak up because it was not just about me. It was others involved in this murder. So all this is coming together, and this is why we're seeing almost, I don't know, it's like a house of cards.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, we have some elements of the puzzle now. We know about the 3 suspects who were detained, about Yorgen Fenech, and about Shkembri and Konrad Midzi. From your own perspective, are these elements conducive to a fact that this is something that ultimately has been decided by the highest echelons in the government in Malta?
Well, Hashem, I think that's a rhetorical question. I mean, if you look at those names, if you look at the positions, then everything points to an assassination coordinated by the state. We spent a long time wondering whether it was the economy minister, the chief of staff, the prime minister himself. But after a few months, we realized that it might have been all of them. They had common interests. So this was likely a case of a constellation of different forces within government, which had one common shared purpose: to silence my mother. We don't have the evidence to conclude that that was the case, but it's becoming increasingly clear that a very large number of people in government were in some way involved in this crime, either by commissioning it or helping with the cover-up.
Rebecca, in the absence of transparency from the government, this is what we know so far. The government is trying to implicate Yorgen Fenech. Yorgen Fenech, on the other hand, is trying to say this is something that has been done or instigated by Shkembri and Konrad Midzi. Is it about time for an international investigation into the case of Daphne Caruana?
Well, what we need imminently is the criminal investigation to be allowed to run its course unfettered and in a transparent manner. And at the same time, there is also still a need for the public inquiry to proceed. This is a step that many of us called for over a number of months and will finally progress in the coming weeks. A public inquiry to establish questions like what the government knew and should have known about Daphne's assassination, if they could have acted to prevent the assassination and save her life, and really importantly, what lessons can be drawn for the future. And that's a crucial point when you look at the risks faced by courageous journalists in Malta that are continuing to probe into these topics, such as corruption, which we know are dangerous. Until we understand what happened and why, and until everybody involved is brought to justice, Malta's press freedom climate will remain poor, and journalists who are investigating stories in the public interest will continue to do so at great risk.
Herman, I mean, if you look at the blogs by Daphne at the beginning, she was basically accusing the Prime Minister for turning the country into a haven for dirty money. She was also criticizing the Economy Minister, Chris Cardona. Are we seeing a pattern here where most likely, with the announcement by the Prime Minister, we are likely to see many other senior cabinet members either to resign or face justice in the near future?
Unlikely, because not only that, only yesterday there was a parliamentary group meeting, and one of the ministers you just mentioned, Chris Cardona, who suspended himself last week from Parliament, was actually reinstated in the group. So, no, I don't think there are going to be more resignations. I'd also like to correct something which was said. Yorgen Fenech did not mention Konrad Midzi in connection with the murder. He is pointing more towards Keith Shkembri here. Mitzi was involved with Fenech where it came to opening secret accounts. They were going to be funneling, imagine, 5,000 euros a day through these secret accounts. So no, in Malta we do not have a culture of resignations. But the fact that we've had now three resignations, well, Prime Minister announced his resignation, but in fact we've had three. This is unprecedented in our history. So this is why there's a bit of a political earthquake at the moment. But should other people go? Of course, people are out there are saying, you know, the entire cabinet should go at this stage. Because if it's not, if you weren't part of this crime, but some people might possibly have been involved in a possible cover-up.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, it's been now 2 years that your mother has been was killed. Do you think that, how do you see, first of all, how do you see the international reaction, particularly from the European Union? Has it been stronger enough?
My mother campaigned for years for Malta to join the European Union because she saw it as the best guarantee of protecting Malta's rule of law in the event that the Labour Party won power again. She was let down badly by the European Union. After she published information on the Panama Papers, the reaction was very weak. After Malta decided to start selling citizenship, again, the reaction was very weak. It's weak mainly for the reason that the European Union depends on national governments. It depends on the governments of member states to trigger Article 7, for example, or to prevent a country from selling European citizenship. And Muscat had very, very smoothly engineered a lot of friendships across the European Union, also in order to guarantee a place for himself in the European Union. He campaigned to become president of the European Council. He failed, fortunately, as otherwise we wouldn't be talking about the Maltese Prime Minister. We would be talking about the president of the European Council being implicated in the cover-up of the assassination of a journalist. So no, the reaction from the European Union has not been sufficient. All the change we're seeing now is only thanks to civil society, to journalists. The Council of Europe in Strasbourg, which was seen by many as almost an obsolete institution, has actually been far more powerful than the European Union in my mother's case. It agreed on our request to appoint a special rapporteur to look into my mother's assassination, into the context. And that special rapporteur set a deadline for the Maltese government to set up a public inquiry into the circumstances of her assassination. So the real concrete results came from elsewhere, not from Brussels. From everywhere but Brussels.
Rebecca, why this muted reaction from the European Council and from the European Union, given that the ideals for which Daphne was killed are in a way or another one of the fundamentals of the European Union, which is basically the freedom of expression?
Well, I think the muted reaction, first of all, to recent developments is in part because things are really happening so quickly in Malta that most are trying to get a sense of what will stick and what won't. And day to day, we're seeing quite a few developments still. But in general, over the past 2 years, the international reaction in terms of states and in terms of intergovernmental organizations has not been strong enough. In part, I think it took some time for the international community to recognize just exactly what was going on in Malta, because the assassination of a journalist didn't happen out of nowhere. But we did see some steps, some really important work take place in the immediate aftermath. Reports by bodies such as the Venice Commission, GRECO, which is the Group of States Against Corruption, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, as Andrew has mentioned, the European Parliament. We've seen now a number of reports that shed light on systemic failings in Malta, and in particular, issues related to a lack of checks and balances on the Prime Minister. So these are all issues now that we're seeing manifest in real time with the situation in Malta. And I think the message is that states do need to be more vocal to avoid the situation of possibly a failed state within the EU. And that's not limited to just these bodies, but also states that have bilateral relations with Malta, such as the UK. The UK has been conspicuously quiet for some time now, despite a report by a parliamentary body, the Foreign Affairs Committee, which conducted an inquiry into the FCO and global media freedom, specifically called on the UK to take a stronger public stance on Malta. We haven't seen that yet.
Herman, the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, has maintained over the last 2 years that he has absolutely no link to the assassination of Daphne Caruana and that his inner circle was not implicated. This seems to be a political divide in the country. Those who consider him as a hero because he presided over an unprecedented economic growth, and those who said he completely failed in the case of Daphne. Do you think that this political divide is something which is going to help him in the near future reinvent himself, or do you think this is something which is going to put an end to his political career?
Let's remember, this is a country where 2 senior government officials were caught with Panama Papers, and they were allowed to continue doing their job as though nothing happened. So there are some strange things that do happen in Malta. But there's also one other thing. Joseph Muscat is incredibly popular. He wins elections by a landslide. He won the last European elections comfortably, and he's very charming. He's still seen as the man who has really transformed the Labour Party. Now, so all this is happening, all this pressures from civil society is just happening really, really fast. And it's taken even his own supporters by shock. Now, he will always have loyalists. In Malta, we tend to be a bit tribal in our way of thinking politically. You know, you're either with the Reds or with the Blues, and that there's no shades in between, which is quite sad, actually. Because as much as there are the loyalists, and there are tens of thousands who are still wondering why Joseph Muscat is actually going to be stepping down. There are groups as we speak on Facebook saying they should go out and campaign for him to stay on. Yet there are some people who are even supporters of his now. There are people who are thinking and saying, this is not quite right, even if Joseph Muscat had nothing to do. And so far, there is no link whatsoever between Joseph Muscat and the murder. But it comes through the so-called guilt by association because of his connection with Keith Kembry and with Conrad Mitzi.
Andrew, you have campaigned with your family for more truth on the case of your mother. You've said that your family's legacy has been betrayed by powerful governments, by politicians in Europe and in Malta. What do you think should happen next? You are still insisting on an independent investigation, perhaps a United Nations investigation into the case of your mother?
We actually managed to set up an independent public inquiry, which will start its work very soon. The idea of bringing in the United Nations at this stage is likely not very helpful. It would be better if the United Nations, if governments around the world, especially the ones which are friendly with Muscat, actually gave him advice to step down immediately. It would be much better if he heard this from his friends rather than from his enemies. This is the best way to protect the ongoing police investigation in Malta. Where the international community can play a role is in a truth and reconciliation commission, if we ever come to that stage. Justice for my mother now is clearly not enough for the country to heal. It will never heal without justice for my mother, but justice for her alone, knowing what we now know about who was involved in her assassination, will not be enough. There has to be a broad movement for accountability in Malta, and for the country to be able to renew itself, it needs new institutions, which are
Thank you, Rebecca. Less than half a minute, please. What is going to be the next step for Reporters Without Borders?
Well, we continue to campaign for full justice, as I've mentioned, which is bringing everybody involved to court and seeing some prison sentences, actually. There should be some political responsibility greater than what we've seen so far. And it remains to be seen how that will play out. But we also remain committed to encouraging broader reforms to the press freedom environment in Malta. Malta has one of Europe's poorest rankings on our World Press Freedom Index at 77th out of 180 countries, having fallen 30 places since Daphne Caruana Galizia's assassination. And we need to address not only justice for Daphne, but the other reasons for that poor ranking, and act to protect journalists still working in Malta.
Time is out. Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca, Vincent, Andrew Caruana Galizia, and Herman Grech. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.